I mean, it often means local governments, right, and local community organizations to foster these philosophies, to foster these ideas, and put them through and implement through community events and branding, or however you want to do that. But just the messaging of it, I think, will actually have a trickle-down effect inward. And you know what? When that student comes into the class and is well aware of some of the aspects of how they should be looking at themselves, how they should be thinking about themselves, how they should be thinking about when they're interacting with their other peers and classmates, that makes the teacher's job that much easier. It's the beginning of May, and May is National Mental Health Month. I think they recall this something else this year, but either way, we're really diving into mental health this month. So what better way to do that than to talk about the CASTLE SEL framework? And the CASEL framework is one of the big frameworks being taught now regarding social and emotional learning. And the reason I'm doing this study is I thought originally, I said, you know what, every single teacher knows CASEL. And you know what's funny? The few teachers that are some of my best friends, I've reached out to and I said, hey, you guys are familiar with the CASEL framework, right? And they're like, nah, I mean, they talk to us about SEL, but I've never heard of that. So I'm like, okay. So there are teachers out there who are not familiar, and I figured, you know what? Let's run it down. Let's talk today about the CASEL framework, and I want to point out some interesting things about the visual. Because if you go online and you search CASEL framework or CASTLE SEL, the picture is going to come up. The big, this thing right here, the little circle with all the diagrams. And I noticed some interesting things about it, and I want to kind of talk to you about that and pose some questions. So what does CASEL actually stand for? Well, CASEL stands for the Collaborative for Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning. Now, today's episode is not going into the history of it, the founder of it. I'm not going there. I just really want to talk about the framework itself. So if we take a look at this here, we see that there are 5 main, what we call core competencies to SEL. Okay, you'll see that the self-awareness and self-management, we have social awareness and relationship skills, and we have responsible decision-making. My entire program that I work and present to high school students is so focused on this CASEL framework. Not that it's meant to be, but it just happens to be, right? Because when you think about responsible decision-making, that is kind of the crux, and that is where we put the pen to paper when we talk about self-awareness, self-management, social awareness, and relationship skills. It's like, okay, we've learned these 4, now let's go make these good or bad decisions depending on kind of what what the situation calls for. So if we talk about these 5 core competencies, self-awareness is really, and self-management is, the self-awareness is really what are we thinking and feeling about ourselves, being aware of our emotions, being aware of our feelings, being aware of how we actually manage that, because that is, once we understand what we're feeling and maybe why we're feeling that, then we can work on the management part of this. How do we positively manage our emotions? Listen, I am a 36-year-old adult who still has trouble managing his emotions. Sometimes it's hard. Emotions sometimes get the best of us. Emotions can cloud our judgment. We like to think that we're rational human being decision makers, but we're just sometimes emotional animals. It's the reality of it. And that's okay. But the more we can kind of manage our outward expression of our emotions, the better off we are, especially for impulsive teenagers. The next 2 over here is social awareness and relationship skills. So how are you aware of you being operating through your school and your world? Are you aware of how you are developing relationships with other teachers and friends and other adults and whatever it may be? How do we positively improve upon our social, I don't want to say status, but our social space, right? And this is something that I would have loved to really, I don't know how to say understand, but really be aware of and have this moment when I was in high school. Because when I was in high school, I was a mess. I just was so happy all the time. I really was. I was really happy for the most part. And I just was running amok. And I didn't even realize the way I was coming off to some people. I didn't even understand that there were people that really didn't like me. And I just was everything's so excited. I was so fast and so excited. It's just like, yeah, there's some people that don't like you. And not that your goal is to have everybody like you, but it may be a time for some reflection. It may be a time to look inward. I don't have to tell you, students today are way too stressed, overwhelmed, and anxious about their lives and their futures. This is why I do what I do. As a youth speaker, I teach students to step back from the situation, see the choices they have in front of them, make great decisions, and build positive patterns around this process. Whether it's substance abuse, bullying, or stress about their digital lives, the students I've worked with have had some great success. So I want to work with your students. I want to come down to your school and your event and actually teach your students the art and the science of making great decisions. So click the link below and schedule your call with me so I can learn a little bit more about what you're looking for in your next speaker. And then finally, responsible decision making. How do we look at the moments in front of us and look at the time in our lives and say, okay, if I do this, what are the consequences? What are the long-term and short-term consequences? If I do that, will this have a positive impact on my life? Will my 90-year-old self really care about XYZ? Like all these factors that come into responsible decision making. Now, if you notice, okay, these core competencies are colored. The orange, self-awareness and self-management, are intrapersonal skills, are intrapersonal competencies. What are happening with inside? The green, very interestingly color-coded, are interpersonal, how we are engaging with the world around us. And obviously, good color choice of yellow being the responsible decision-making. Now, fairly simple to understand. These competencies, though, can be very, very unpacked. You could probably get, numerous degrees in understanding these competencies. But what's really interesting and sometimes challenging for teachers is that there is a ton of different activities and lessons that you can present in trying to have students become more aware of themselves and how they aware of themselves with others, right? So if you are looking for an awesome resource, I think you should take a look at a gentleman I had on as a guest a while back named, I'm going to forget his last name, Todd I forget his last name, but you should check out his channel. He has fantastic lessons that he records and he puts out into the world, and they're really, really cool. Now, let's take a look at the rings around the side, the blue rings around the outside here. We have classrooms, schools, families, and communities. And as you can see, the color coding gets a little bit more dim as it goes around, right? Because classrooms, that's where the rubber meets the road. That's where SEL is being taught formally. That's where the instruction is happening and students are understanding and learning formally, okay, this is what I need to start thinking about. Here's some of the things I could do differently in my life. And obviously schools is a big one, right? The principal and the superintendent, how they are treating the SEL directive throughout their buildings and their district. How serious are they taking it? How much are they making it a focus on their end? And then, of course, families, because while this is all great and dandy and fine, what happens when a student goes home? Obviously, if they don't have a loving and supporting home, it's going to be trickier and harder to teach them social and emotional aspects of life. that are kind of put on hold once they go home. And then the communities. Now, what's really interesting about this whole process is that when you look at these rings around the side, it's really interesting because we think that the most important thing, and that's why it's dark blue, is classrooms, right? The classroom is where the most important instruction is happening and the most effective instruction is happening. And that may be true, but, right, it kind of goes to show that as you go outward away from the inner circle, it gets harder and harder to implement, and not only implement, but reinforce these SEL tactics. Watch this though. Imagine if you reversed it. Imagine if you thought that the community was the most important aspect of implementing SEL frameworks. What would happen then? Well, families would be much more on board. Mom and dad, grandma and grandpa would be much more on board if everywhere they looked around their community, these types of exercises and philosophies were being displayed and taught and practiced. Well, mom and dad would just be that much more on board, and they would understand it, and then they would reinforce it in the home. And what would that do? Well, that would reinforce the school system, because the taxpayers would come to board meetings and say, hey, listen, this is the stuff we're doing at home, but when my kid comes to school, we got issues with bullies, we got issues with social media, like, you guys got to step up. And then, of course, what is that going to do? Well, then that's going to make the classroom teacher, expected to do X, Y, Z. Sorry, teachers, just another expectation of us. But it's really interesting because we see it as the one direction is moving out. But from where I'm looking at it, if we are able to somehow influence communities, and what does that mean? Well, I mean, it often means local governments, right, and local community organizations to foster these philosophies, to foster these ideas and put them through and implement through community events and branding, or however you want to do that. But just the messaging of it, I think, will actually have a trickle-down effect inward. And you know what? When that student comes into the class and is well aware of some of the aspects of how they should be looking at themselves, how they should be thinking about themselves, how they should be thinking about when they're interacting with their other peers and classmates, that makes the teacher's job that much easier. And then, of course, that makes just everything that much easier. So, my 2 cents on the CASTLE framework. I think down the road, we're definitely going to dig into this a little bit deeper, but this is the general framework. And if you haven't understood what you've heard of CASTLE and you're not really sure, but there it is. It's pretty simple, but extremely effective. And I love the visual aid. And I just would love to see more and more schools and communities begin to understand that if you want your students to succeed academically, they 100% need to succeed personally and socially and emotionally. It just doesn't go one without the other. So that is my time today. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you like it, then let me know by hitting like, hitting subscribe, and hitting the bell notification every time I release a new video. And if you really like today's episode, then I think you'll also like this one right over here.